the anterior and posterior lobes, the vermis, and the roof of the fourth ventricle. Here are the cerebral hemispheres. Here's the corpus callosum. Here are the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. Here are the oculomotor nerve, the optic chiasm, the optic nerves, the infundibulum, and the mammillary bodies. In the model, here are the lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. Here's the third ventricle, the interventricular foramen, the choroid plexus, the cerebral aqueduct, and the fourth ventricle. Here's the hypothalamus, here's the infundibulum, and the pituitary gland. That brings us to the end of this section on the brain. In the next section, we'll look at the cranial nerves. In this section, we'll look at the 12 cranial nerves, the sympathetic trunk, and the cervical nerves. The cranial nerves are numbered by the order in which they leave the cranial cavity. Earlier in this tape, we saw them emerging from the brain. In this section, we'll follow the course of each nerve, look at its principal branches, and summarize its functions. We'll begin with the first 6 cranial nerves. The first, the olfactory, and the second, the optic, transmit our senses of smell and of eyesight. The third, the oculomotor, the fourth, the trochlear, and the sixth, the abducent, are motor nerves to the eye muscles. And the fifth, the trigeminal, is a large motor and sensory nerve to the face and jaws. The first cranial nerve, the olfactory nerve, is extremely short. It consists of a series of fine filaments which arise from the olfactory bulb on the underside of the frontal lobe. On each side, the olfactory bulb lies here, just above the cribriform plate. Here's a frontal section in the dry skull that goes through the cribriform plates. They're here. On each side, the cribriform plate forms the narrow roof of the nasal cavity. Here's a medial view of the nasal cavity. The cribriform plate is here. The filaments of the olfactory nerve, here they are in close-up, pass through the cribriform plate and run just beneath the mucous membrane to reach nerve endings in this olfactory area on the lateral and medial surfaces of the nasal cavity. The next nerve we'll look at is the second cranial nerve, the optic nerve. We've seen the proximal ends of the optic nerves emerging from the optic chiasm. Here's the optic nerve passing forward beneath the dura to enter the optic canal, which starts here. Here's the optic canal in the dry skull. Here on each side of the optic chiasm are the divided internal carotid arteries. Just beneath the chiasm is the roof of the pituitary fossa. Here's the divided stalk of the pituitary gland. To follow the optic nerve, we'll remove the roof of the orbit, leaving the optic canal intact. We'll remove this nerve and the orbital fat, and these two muscles, which we'll see later. Here's the optic nerve. It enters the orbit between the tendons of origin of the rectus muscles. It passes forwards and laterally to enter the back of the eyeball. Strictly speaking, the optic nerve isn't a nerve, it's an extension of the brain. It's covered throughout its course by extensions of all 3 meningeal layers, dura, arachnoid, and pia. Here, we've made a window in the dura surrounding the optic nerve. Here's the edge of the dura. Here's the nerve itself. Here's the arachnoid. The dura is continuous with the outer layer of the eyeball, the sclera. We'll be returning here shortly. For now, we'll put the contents of the orbit back in place. The optic chiasm is a crossover point for optic nerve fibers. The fibers of each nerve that connect to the medial half of the retina cross over into the opposite optic tract. The fibers that connect to the lateral halves of the retinae stay on the same side. Now we'll move on to look at the third, fourth, and sixth cranial nerves, the oculomotor, trochlear, and abducent. They're motor nerves. Between them, they supply the 6 muscles that move the eye and also the levator of the upper lid. As we've seen, the oculomotor nerve arises between the cerebral peduncles, the trochlear nerve arises from the back of the midbrain, and the abducent nerve arises below the pons. The bony opening that these 3 nerves pass through is the superior orbital fissure, but their openings in the dura are quite a bit further back. The oculomotor nerve passes through the dura just alongside the posterior clinoid process, which is here. The trochlear nerve passes through the dura here. The abducent nerve down here. To follow them, we'll remove the dura over this area.